Live from the studios of Brack Monitor, this is Monitor Monday for February 16th, 2026. Here's today's rundown. Aetna's controversial payment policy continues to generate confusion. Senior healthcare consultant Cheryl Ericson has our lead story. We will also hear from healthcare attorneys David Glazer and Nicole Emanuel. Adam Brunman delivers the legislative update, and Dr. Ronald Hirsch makes his Monday rounds. Now here's the publisher of Rack Monitor and the host of Monitor Monday, Chuck Buck.
And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the live edition of Monitor Monday. We have a great deal of healthcare news to report, so we begin this morning, as we usually do, with Dr. Ronald Hirsch. He's making his Monday rounds here on Monitor Monday.
Monday Rounds is sponsored by R1 Physician Advisory Solutions. Here now making his Monday rounds is Dr. Ronald Hirsch.
Well, good morning, all. Let's start with what seems to be the never-ending topic of conversation, the new tactics by Medicare Advantage plans to deny or reduce payment. Last week, Independence Blue Cross announced that starting in March, they'll be adopting Aetna's tactic to pay less for inpatient admissions that do not meet inpatient criteria. But unlike Aetna, Independence will be using Interqual rather than MCG and will only be approving inpatient stays of 6 days or more without review, whereas Aetna is much more generous and allows 5-day or longer stays to be paid as inpatient. I suspect that Independence blew the short straw amongst Blue Cross plans and was chosen to implement this and face the wrath so that other Blue Cross plans across the country could decide whether they want to do the same. This is going to be a growing problem for hospitals without access to both MCG and Interqual, as it seems appeals will need to show that the payer applied criteria improperly. We're going to be hearing more about this from Cheryl Ericson in her segment coming up. Now, I've also discussed here how this new CMS regulations require MA plans to notify the patient within 72 hours if they issue a denial, and many plans have been asking the hospital to deliver that notice to the patient. I suggested telling the payers to go pound sand and force them to figure out how to get it delivered, but Tiffany Ferguson, who we all know and love, has a better idea. She says, tell the payer that you will deliver the denial letter, but at the same time, you'll be asking the patient to sign the Medicare Appointment of Representative form, and the hospital will then be filing a formal appeal on behalf of the patient. Now that is ingenious. Now, moving on to the never-ending saga of expiring forms, we now have to add the advanced beneficiary notice, which expired on January 31st. As you'd expect, I contacted CMS and they once again said the expired form remains valid until the new version is approved, and then there'll be the grace period. Now, with other forms, the content of the new version that they proposed is very similar, but in one way, CMS really went out on a limb. The old ABN requires the patient to check one of 3 boxes on how they want to proceed. The new form changes those boxes to circles. It'll be really interesting to see how the Office of Management and Budget reacts to this dramatic change of this form. And finally, you may recall that 2 weeks ago, I told you about a hospital that was told by a QIO that they could not charge the patient for care because the detailed notice of discharge was expired. Well, that hospital complained to CMS and they finally got an apology from the QIO. Well, last week, the other QIO had an article in their monthly newsletter noting that the DND must be delivered, but it has no effect on patients' financial liability. Clearly, both QIOs received some remedial education from CMS. It's great to see that CMS does take your comments seriously, and they do address them. And while they often may not respond directly to you about your comments and concerns, they're going to take action when it's warranted. Thanks, Chuck. Back to you.
Hirsch. That was the Vice President of R1 Physician Advisory Solutions, Ronald Hirsch, MD. Dr. Hirsch was making his Monday rounds here on Monitor Monday. And here now with the Monitor Monday Rack Report is our good friend, healthcare attorney Nicole Emanuel. Good morning, Nicole.
Hello, and happy Rack Monitor Monday. This past Friday, I presented with Leslie Boyles at the AHLA Winter Institute, Advising Providers in AI in Healthcare Conference. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because the deep dive that I needed to do in order to create the PowerPoint gave me some interesting issues to ponder regarding AI and healthcare law. For example, there is a deep constitutional issue that arises when AI becomes the accuser. There is no human being to confront. The right to confront one's accuser is one of the oldest and most fundamental principles. While the Sixth Amendment's confrontation clause applies directly in criminal proceedings, its underlying principle that a party must have a meaningful opportunity to challenge the evidence and its source extends into civil and administrative proceedings through the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. When an overpayment determination, fraud allegation, or audit finding is generated by an algorithm rather than a human investigator, there is no witness with personal knowledge to question. There is no individual who observed the alleged wrongdoing, exercised clinical judgment, or made an independent credibility determination. Instead, there is only output. This creates a profound due process problem. Due process requires notice and a meaningful opportunity to be heard at a meaningful time and at a meaningful manner. A meaningful opportunity to be heard necessarily includes the ability to test the reliability of adverse evidence. When the government or its contractors rely on opaque algorithms, often proprietary and shielded from disclosures as trade secrets, the provider is deprived of the ability to examine the methodology, challenge its assumptions, or expose its flaws. Courts have repeatedly recognized that decisions based on undisclosed or unchallenged evidence violate due process. An AI system cannot be cross-examined. It cannot explain while it flags certain claims, what assumptions it made, or whether it misinterpreted clinical context. Without that transparency, the proceedings risk becoming fundamentally unfair. The problem is confounded in the Medicare and Medicaid context because overpayment determinations often rely on statistical extrapolation and contractor description. Federal regulations require that extrapolation methodologies be statistically valid and that providers be given access to the sampling methodology. Just look at Medicare Program Integrity Manual, Chapter 8, 8.4.4. If an AI model replaces or supplements traditional statistical sampling, but its methodology cannot be disclosed or explained in understandable terms, providers are effectively denied their regulatory right to challenge the overpayment calculation. Courts have emphasized that the administrative determinations must be supported by reliable, probative, and substantial evidence. An unexplained algorithmic conclusion standing alone may not meet the evidentiary standard. Bias is another critical issue. AI systems are trained on historical data. If historical data reflects aggressive enforcement patterns or flawed assumptions, AI may replicate and amplify those same patterns. In other words, AI may scale human error. From a legal perspective, this raises questions about fairness. If AI-generated findings disproportionately target certain provider types, specialties, or geographic regions, providers may argue that enforcement is inconsistent or unsupported by individualized review. For example, I have read that government AI systems may be trained, at least in part, on historical findings from UPICs, RACs, MACs, and other third-party auditors. And let me be clear about what this means in practice. These are the very findings that David and I challenge every day. These are the same findings that are routinely overturned on reconsideration at the ALJ level and beyond. These are findings that time and time again we prove to be unsupported, statistically flawed, and clinically uninformed or simply wrong. Don't get me wrong, I am amazed at the capabilities of AI. I only point out that we need to be wary of the implications. Back to you, Chuck.
Wow. Thanks, Nicole, very much. That was healthcare attorney Nicole Manning. Nicole is a partner in the law firm of Nelson Mullins. And coming up at about, let's call it about 12 minutes after the hour in your time zone, we're going to hear from Adam Bredman, healthcare attorney David Glazer, and senior healthcare consultant Cheryl Ericson. She's standing by to report our lead story. It's Monday. It's February the 16th, and you're listening to the live edition of Monitor Monday Standby.
What are the top 10 audit targets for this year? To know these top 10 audit targets, you need to register to listen to senior healthcare consultant Michael Callahan explain why you need to know these top 10 audit targets to protect your facility's revenue. This essential webcast is now available on demand. Register to listen and learn at the RAC University Bookstore.
And thanks, Clark Anthony. And here now with the Monitor Monday Risky Business Report is healthcare attorney David Glazer. Good morning, David. David, as I say every Monday morning, what could be risky this morning, David?
Well, Chuck, I guess it's the risk we'll miss President's Day, but really it's the risk that you'll rely on expert advice rather than digging into the details yourself. So last week, as part of our firm's monthly webinar series, I talked about the 2 midnight rule. Now, in the middle of the talk, I had a bit of an epiphany. So before the 2 midnight rule was finalized, Medicare guidance about the definition of an inpatient stay was remarkably sloppy. The manual said that you should admit a patient if you expected them to be in the hospital overnight. Then, a few sentences later, it suggested using 24 hours as a benchmark. Now, obviously, those two standards are very different, at least outside of the Arctic Circle in winter. There's even another paragraph with a third mushy standard. Now, regular listeners know that I say you should never refund without a regulation that requires it. Here, there was no regulation, and the non-binding guidance was totally internally contradictory. So why were there so many refunds and settlements? Why did hospitals unnecessarily surrender literally millions of dollars? I strongly suspect that in many cases, the people who made the decision to refund or settle did not have a firm grasp on the strength of their legal defenses, and they were relying on advice from someone, and that someone was wrong. So digging into legal details or operational details can seem intimidating. Many years ago, when I was working on the kyphoplasty investigation, I had to learn how interqual worked. Just as Ron mentioned, it can be tough to have both interqual and sort of every metric that's out there. They can be difficult to find, and once you find them, difficult to understand. It was daunting. So after I found the copy of the book, I had to navigate it. A hospital's CEO or CFO or general counsel typically has got no real experience with sort of that level of operational detail. And even if they have the desire to learn it, they often won't have the time. As a result, there's going to be a lot of pressure to defer to an internal or external expert's advice. Now, let me be clear, I wholeheartedly encourage the retention of experts. It's not possible for any human to become an expert on every topic. If you're running a hospital or even just a compliance program, hardly a just, right? That's at a hospital, you're going to need to call on the expertise of other people to some extent. But there's a big difference between involving an expert and relying exclusively on an expert. Getting advice is smart, but relying on the conclusion of the expert without fully understanding their reasoning is where you can get into trouble. If a professional is telling you that you've got a compliance problem, you need to make them spell out the regulation in full detail. I would encourage you to ask the person to highlight the strongest argument that undermines their recommendations and to show you the text. Then I'd be sure to read that source to figure out what they're relying on. Now, this won't help you find documents that your expert entirely overlooked, but at least it will help you verify that their interpretation of a particular text is accurate. In this particular instance, I think any critical reader could have spotted the flaws. If hospital CFOs had required their compliance professionals to show them the language from the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, I think someone would say, wait, this text establishes 3 different standards. How could the government credibly argue we were supposed to know which one to follow? Those questions are apparent even if you don't focus on the fact that manuals aren't binding. So Chuck, The bottom line is that you can't just rely on what other people say. Instead, and this is probably good advice in life, listen to Aretha Franklin. You better think about what you're trying to do. And while this part doesn't fit perfectly with my topic, I will end with, cause freedom. Freedom stands for freedom. Oh, freedom. Yeah, freedom. So happy President's Day, and my apologies for not using the Dead Presidents or Lincoln Park, but I turn it back to you, Chuck.
Thanks, David, very much. That was healthcare attorney David Glazer. David is a shareholder in the law firm of Frederickson and Byron in downtown Minneapolis. And up next, Adam Brenman with the Monitor Monday Legislative Update.
The legislative update is sponsored by Zealous. Zealous is modernizing the healthcare financial experience by bridging gaps and aligning interests across payers, providers, and healthcare consumers.
And here now is Adam Brenman. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning. Thank you. So following Congress's recent failure or success in not extending the expiring tax subsidies for Affordable Care Act marketplace coverage, depending on your political leaning, the ACA has entered an interesting period. Word on the Hill is that the subsidies are now very unlikely to be revived, which has caused policymakers to start debating alternative affordability strategies. And with CMS releasing its 2027 ACA Marketplace Payment Notice Proposed Rule last week, intensifying congressional scrutiny on the ACA and consumers shifting their coverage decisions based on the enhanced subsidies expiration, the ACA's marketplace landscape is evolving, making this a pivotal moment for the future of individual coverage. So let's briefly take a look at the latest, starting with the recently proposed 2027 payment notice. The proposed rule introduces significant structural changes to marketplace plan designs. Among these changes is a proposal to allow non-network qualified health plans, enabling enrollees to use price transparency data to negotiate directly with providers rather than relying on traditional network structures. The rule outlines that these plans would still need to meet ACA standards for essential health benefits and protections, but would operate without contracted provider networks. CMS frames this move as a way to eliminate admin costs related to network management and potentially reduce premiums. The agency is also proposing to eliminate the requirement to offer standardized plans and limits on non-standardized plan options, reversing policies put in place over the recent years. This would allow insurers to offer an unlimited number of non-standardized plan designs with the intent of fostering more innovation in plan structures and potentially expanding consumer choice, particularly in catastrophic and alternative benefit plans. Now, these plan design flexibilities, combined with changes to cost-sharing structures for bronze and catastrophic plans, represent an intentional shift toward deregulation and more of a consumer focus. Additionally, consider again the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credits at the start of 2026, which is already having visible consequences. As those subsidies expired and ACA premiums overall have risen, consumers are increasingly turning to non-ACA alternatives, such as direct primary care memberships, medical tourism, and high-risk indemnity plans. As a result, providers, anticipating an influx of uninsured patients, are beginning to revive pre-ACA safety net strategies. For example, we've started to see hospitals setting aside large sums of money to help manage more uncompensated care costs. Now, on the payer side, major insurers are projecting enrollment losses, approximately 3 million fewer enrollees in the ACA in 2026 based on recent earnings calls, further underscoring the shifting dynamics in the ACA market. While CMS proposes major structural changes to the ACA, Congress is also focusing on marketplace oversight. A House committee recently subpoenaed 8 major ACA insurers as part of an inquiry into potential fraud involving premium subsidies. And while details remain limited, the investigation signals concern over both the integrity of subsidy payments generally and how private insurers operate in the ACA marketplace. So to sum up, the ACA marketplace is entering a new period, defined by deregulation, experimentation in plan design, and shifting consumer behavior. As federal policymakers debate next steps, the marketplace stands at a crossroads, one where impending decisions will reshape the contours of coverage, affordability, and access for millions of Americans. So Chuck, stay tuned. The way this plays out is going to be quite fascinating. Back to you.
Adam, and I will stand by. Folks, that was Adam Brenman. Adam is a legislative analyst for Zealous. Thanks again, Adam. We appreciate it. We'll be right back, folks.
Now you can elevate your compliance and revenue cycle integrity when you're a RAC Monitor subscriber. Stay informed and remain compliant. Plus, you'll have access to the RAC Monitor library of essential webcasts. And remember to take advantage of the 7-day free trial. Take your compliance and revenue cycle integrity to the next level when you become a RAC Monitor subscriber. Subscribe today. Become a RAC Monitor subscriber.
And thank you very much, Clark Anthony. And here now to report our lead story is Senior Healthcare Consultant Cheryl Ericson. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning, Chuck and listeners. MA plans are implementing policies designed to maintain current profit margins by reducing payment for valid healthcare services like Aetna's level of severity inpatient payment policy. Although most hospitals view this policy as non-compliant with Medicare regulations, Dr. Hirsch verified that CMS has no problems with it because it meets the 2 midnight rule, making it a contractual issue. I'm also disheartened by hearing about today's report that there's an additional payer following in Aetna's footsteps. If you're not familiar with this policy, Aetna will approve urgent and emergent hospital stays across 1 midnight as inpatient, but inpatient stays of less than 5 midnights are subject to a level of severity review to determine the payment rate. If MCG criteria are met, claims are paid at a higher severity rate, but if they do not, payment is made at a lower severity rate comparable to the observation rate. By approving most claims as inpatient admissions, Aetna is bypassing patient protections associated with an adverse organizational determination. Aetna claims the policy relieves hospitals of the burdens associated with appealing an inpatient denial. But in order to receive full payment, the hospital must appeal the level of severity determination. This increases hospital burden without the same protections that would be afforded if the inpatient stay was downgraded to observation or denied. Inpatient hospital admission determinations are unique because they're dependent on physician judgment at the time of the inpatient order. Furthermore, it's not necessary for beneficiaries to meet an inpatient level of care as may be defined by commercial screening tools in order for Part A payment to be appropriate, as stated in CMS regulations and reiterated in CMS 14021F. Which explicitly states MA plans may not use interqual or MCG criteria or similar products to change coverage or payment criteria already established under traditional Medicare laws. Use of MCG in this capacity also conflicts with MCG guidance that recognizes patient status depends on individual patient assessments by clinicians, and as such, MCG decision support tools are designed to be used in conjunction with the clinical judgment of the healthcare provider. Linking inpatient payment criteria to MCG subverts Medicare inpatient payment criteria. Throughout Medicare regulations, payment criteria is discussed and defined. Section 1852A1 of the Social Security Act and CMS regulations require MA organizations provide coverage of, by furnishing, arranging for, or making payment for all items and services covered by Part A, which is inpatient hospital services. Additionally, MA plans must comply with general coverage and benefit conditions included in traditional Medicare law, which includes payment criteria for inpatient admissions. Specifically, CMS states it's irrelevant whether traditional Medicare considers the criteria part of a coverage rule or a payment rule, as both address the scope of items and services for which benefits are available to Medicare beneficiaries under Parts A and Part B. Medicare does not set the payment rate for MA plans, but they do regulate inpatient payment criteria. Hospital services that cross 2 midnights are generally appropriate for payment under Medicare Part A, which means inpatient services. Full stop. Aetna Severity Policy violates the 2 midnight rule by requiring MCG criteria is met for full inpatient payment. Inpatient admissions that cross 2 midnights should not be subject to payment downgrades. It's preposterous to think that 4 days of hospital care does not demonstrate severity, especially when the median length of stay for an MSDRG, a Medicare Severity Diagnostic Related Group, the payment methodology used by Traditional Medicare is 4 days. This policy appears to be part of a trend reported by the Office of the Inspector General that found a central concern about capitulated payment models, including the model used in Medicare Advantage, is the potential incentive for insurers to deny access to services and payment in an attempt to increase profits. CMS annual audits of MA organizations have highlighted widespread and persistent problems related to inappropriate denials of services and payment. Consequently, the only recourse hospitals have is to end their contracts with the MA plans. Doing so allows them to be appropriately reimbursed for inpatient services under traditional Medicare payment criteria as an out-of-network provider. I'm not advising hospitals to do so. I'm only pointing out what many hospitals have already concluded. I hope CMS will consider their current stance on Aetna's level of severity payment policy. If allowed to stand, other payers may replicate this policy, and it's happening even faster than we expected, which could further erode the tenuous relationship between hospitals and MA plans. Back to you, Chuck.
Wow, thanks, Cheryl, very much. That was the Senior Director of Clinical Policy and Education for the Brundage Group, Cheryl Ericson. And by the way, you can listen to Cheryl every Tuesday morning on Talk 10 Tuesday when she reports on clinical documentation integrity. Hey, David, we got a couple of minutes, so let's take a look at some of the questions that have been coming in as we've been on the air, okay?
You bet. So actually, this is a question for Adam, so if we could pull him in here. Adam, I know that Kate last week talked a bit about sort of how the extensions for telehealth and hospital at home work, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat this morning. It's different than it has in the past. If you could just kind of walk us through that while I clear my throat.
Yeah, so of late, we've been seeing those sort of quick multi-month Band-Aid solutions. So telehealth in particular, right? They'll extend it every 3 or 6 months, and then they have to go back to the drawing board each time, find consensus in a bill, a spending bill or other, and extend again and again and again, right? This time, though, most recently, the spending bill that the president just recently signed will extend those flexibilities all the way through the end of 2027. So while that's nice, it's a 2-year, come January 2028 or around Christmas time in 2027, all these folks in Congress are going to be back debating this exact same issue. So it's not like they've extended them permanently or anything like that, but at least we're not going to have to report out or be looking back at 3 more months, we have to extend again. And I'll also throw one additional note out because I think this has been underrepresented. That legislation also included a slew of new requirements for Medicare Advantage provider directories and the information that goes into them. So if you are an MA provider or an MA plan, et cetera, you may want to take a look at some of those provisions because they are law. They are expected to be implemented in 2027 and 2028 too. So it's not just the telehealth flexibilities or the hospital flexibilities, where we've got some other flexibilities in there or new provisions entirely that have sort of gone under the radar a little bit.
Thank you so much, Adam. So, and I will just, before I turn back to you, Chuck, I'll just remind, because there have been a bunch of questions in here from people who missed part of the broadcast. A reminder, you can always listen to us on the website. There are your podcast choices, and I think LinkedIn. So many ways to listen to this later. Chuck, I'll turn it back to you. Happy President's Day.
Hey, thank you, David, very much, and happy President's Day to you as well. And folks, that is going to be a wrap for this live edition of Monitor Monday. We thank you so very much for being with us today, and a very special thank you to our panelists today. Adam Brenman, thanks, Adam. Nicole Emanuel, Cheryl Ericson, she reported our lead story. David Glader, and of course, Dr. Ronald Hirsch. And one more thing before we go, please join me tomorrow on Talk 10 Tuesday. Also, to David's point, if you can't listen to us live, you can always listen to us on demand on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform. This is Chuck Buck reporting for Rack Monitor Monday. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.